Sure.
Hello, good morning, everyone. And it's early morning in Sri Lanka. And good evening, Professor Bruton. Yeah, it's a little bit, I think around 7:30 p.m. in Calgary. And so as one goal of the ENTC strategic plan, we plan to introduce a series of webinars from eminent researchers in the world to share their experience on research and their academic careers to enlighten our young academic staff as well as the undergraduates and graduate students. In the first webinar today, we have our guest speaker is Professor Leonard Bruton. Let me introduce him briefly. Lenty Bruton is a Emeritus Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and Adjunct Professor in Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. He carries out research in the fields of analog and digital signal processing with emphasis on multidimensional circuits and systems, and he is especially interested in the emerging applications of 2D, 3D, and 4D filters for real-time directional filtering, including applications in beamforming and digital image processing. He is the inventor of a number of widely used microelectronic filtering methods, including the class of frequency-dependent negative resistance analog filters, or simply we call FDNR filters, and the class of lossless discrete integrator, LDI discrete domain. He holds a number of patents. Also, he has held the positions of Head of Electrical Engineering, Dean of Engineering, and Vice President Research at the University of Calgary, and was a founding Dean of Engineering at the University of Victoria. His illustrious career has numerous awards, and so he was awarded, and he's a recipient of the 2002 Educational Award and 2007 Technical Achievement Award and the 50th Jubilee Medal from the IEEE Circuits and Systems Society. In 1994, he was awarded Outstanding Engineering Award of IEEE Canada Region 7 with the citation for leadership in engineering and the engineering profession and for research in the field of microelectronic digital and analog real-time filter design. In Canada, he received Manning Principal Award for Innovation in 1992, and he is one of the 162 scientists selected for inclusion in the textbook Great Canadian Scientist by Barry Shell. Also in 1992, he received the Alberta Science and Technology Award for Innovation in Science in recognition for his leadership in science. Also in 1993, he received the federal government of Canada's 125th anniversary of Canadian Confederation Medal in recognition of his significant contribution to compatriots community and to Canada. He also a recipient of the Centennial Award from the Alberta Association of Professional Engineers, Geologists, and Geophysicists of Alberta. He is a Life Fellow of the IEEE and a member of the Royal Society of Canada. In fact, he was elevated as a Fellow of the IEEE in 1981, as I remember, before I was born. So, Professor Bruton, I would like to invite you to share your thoughts with our audience. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chamira. It's lovely to see you. And I guess I must start by saying that my thoughts and prayers are with Sri Lankans during this very difficult time. It is difficult living conditions, I understand that. And I hope that in some way this talk will contribute to relieving the pressures that many of you are feeling on a day-to-day basis. I visited Sri Lanka under the guidance of Arjuna Madyanaki, who was my first Sri Lankan graduate student. I've had many since, and they've all been exceptional students. So the first thing I would say is you come from an excellent university. All the students that have come from Sri Lanka that I've had the privilege to work with have become friends. Most of them have become friends, and they've been a pleasure to work with. I'm also a cricket fan, so it has given me the opportunity to talk cricket. And for a population of the size of Sri Lanka, you have had a remarkable team maybe not quite so good as it used to be, but we are not here to discuss that. So the first question I asked myself when I was invited to give this talk is, why would you invite a retired professor in his 80th year to speak to students who could be younger than 20 years old? Well, there's some arguments against inviting me, age being one, out of date with modern trends being another, coming from a different background and culture than Sri Lanka, and certainly no longer as productive in research as I used to be. But then I got thinking about it and I thought, well, perhaps a little immodestly, what about arguments in favor of inviting me? One obvious in favor argument is that in my day, if we weren't enjoying a talk, we pretty much had to sit there and take it, because the alternative was quite rude. We had to get up and walk out or fall asleep. All you need to do is click if you become disinterested, and that's not a problem. So I would say, in terms of content and arguments in favor of giving this talk, that certainly persuaded me to accept, is that there are various aspects of research that, at least in my mind, transcend the technology and transcend the decades that have passed since I was a student. They seem to underlie the mind that can be successful in research. And that's what I want to share with you. So I'll quickly run through the list and then I'll talk about them. Number one in my list for the attributes of a budding STEM researcher, and I hope the STEM has reached you as science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I'm not talking about history or humanities at this time. Then the attributes that I see are curiosity, determination and confidence, personal sacrifice, the need for champions, parents, spouses, friends, and peers, independence of thought. My comment about that I will make later, but to be independent in your thinking is generally pretty important. Critical thinking, as opposed to a lack of critical thinking. The pursuit of truth, that lies at the root of everything we do. Everything we do is to try and narrow the uncertainty to reach that goal of the ultimate truth, which we will never get to, but we will strive to reveal. The breadth of knowledge and awareness of progress in STEM is a critical component that I'll come to. The need for mentors and heroes. We can't work on our own. We don't live in isolation. We're not all Albert Einsteins. We don't work away in a patent office on our own these days. We need to work with other people. And mentors, at least in my life, have been critical. I would not have done any of the things that I had done without mentors and heroes. These are people that I may not have met, or at least at the time I was looking at their work, but I aspired to be as good as them. And there are quite a few people like that. The recognition of standing on the shoulders of others. We don't operate alone. We look at generations of incredible researchers, some well-known, some not so well-known. Old wine in new bottles is something I want to talk about. Genuine collaborations. Collaborations are obviously important, more important in some fields than others, but they have to be genuine. And a recent topic is the role of metrics, the measures we use to determine whether our research is worthwhile and if it's going to make an impact. Then I will go on and talk about the PhD degree and the master's degree, because I'm addressing students here, and some of you may be thinking in terms of graduate work. The notion of selecting a supervisor, or the supervisor selecting you, and then taking a real chance, talking about possible topics in very general terms that you might think about. And again, I'm trying to put myself in your position. It's very difficult for me to do. It's been a long time since I was in Sri Lanka. But what I might be thinking of if I was in Sri Lanka and I was a student. So that's the plan. We're at 7:40. I was originally asked to speak for most of the time allocated, but I would rather speak for less time to open up time for questions and answers. So let me start with curiosity, and I'll give myself a minute or two on that. I know, because my parents told me, that I was almost annoyingly curious as a child. I took watches apart. I never got them back together again, just to see how those watches worked. The springs ended up on the ceiling, I've been told. I wanted to get the answers, how, why. I was born that way. That's not always a good thing, but as a researcher, I would say it's essential. I would say if you're not really curious about some things related to the physical sciences and the mathematical sciences, then you probably shouldn't do research. Curiosity has to drive you. And I can say this in my 80th year, I'm as curious now as I was when I was 5. And I hope you are too. Because if you're motivated by curiosity and other things, then you're heading in the right direction. I've had graduate students of immense intelligence. I've had over 100 graduate students, probably about 110. And some of them lack that essential ingredient of curiosity. And it's sad because they shouldn't have been doing research-oriented graduate work. It's a prerequisite. Determination and confidence is the next one on my list. Why are they important? Well, for one thing, if you're at the bleeding, leading edge, you're going to have a lot of naysayers around you. I remember one industrial colleague in a center of excellence that we'd formed in microelectronics, who had read about the session I chaired called Multidimensional Signals and Signal Processing, or something like that. And at the end, we summed up the conference, and he stood up, nice fellow, I grew to like him immensely, and he said, we don't need any more of this nonsense about multidimensional signal processing. And he said it in a very negative way. If you're not determined and you're not confident, those kinds of naysaying comments, you could be wrong. That's another thing. You have to be able to handle failure because many of your ideas will fail. Get ready for that. But be determined and confident in your own ideas and don't let the naysayers knock you off. Personal sacrifices is the next one in my list. I was lucky enough to marry my spouse at the age of 21. We joked that it was a little bit of cradle snatching. But the fact of the matter is, the personal sacrifices that she made on my behalf and that I made in our life together, and Chamira is another example of personal sacrifice. He moved to Canada. It wasn't easy. I will not tell his story. He can tell it. But he made great personal sacrifices in order to succeed. And this is often necessary. It doesn't come easy. It affects your personal life. And it's awfully useful if your people around you support what you're doing. But even if they don't, do it. Determination and confidence and personal sacrifices. That brings me to the need for champions. And what do I mean by the need for champions? I'm talking about parents, spouses, friends, and peers. We all need champions. We need, or we are better off if we have champions around us. I came from a relatively poor working class family in the United Kingdom. None of the extended family or the family had ever been to university. They wouldn't have even known where to find the nearest university. But I had champions. I had people who didn't know anything about what I wanted to do around me, family, friends, spouse, who said, if this is what you want to do, I'm there to help you. If you're a student, I hope you have that. Among friends, among family, it's incredibly helpful. The next thing on my list is independence of thought. I like to joke that committees do not have ideas. They just don't. Research ideas, those eureka moments, cannot come out of two brains simultaneously. That's not an anti-collaboration statement. It's an obvious fact. Eureka moments are what make science what it's worth, and the joy of eureka moments is hard to get across to people who've never had one. And they don't come very often. I look at a 60-year career and I can count on certainly 2 hands and maybe 1, the number of true eureka moments where I say to myself, oh, wow, I don't think anybody's thought that thought before. And it's useful. As an applied scientist, I want it to be useful. As a mathematician, I don't care whether it's useful. So the eureka moments are really important and they're individual. It's your brain and your mind. You can share it with others and you can work in teams. But the breakthroughs, even when teams of pure mathematicians work together, will say the key step was so-and-so said this or did that or wrote this or came up with this proof. It's an independence of thought argument. My next situation I want to describe is critical thinking. We don't have time to discuss critical thinking. You know what it is. It's the ability to, it means nothing to say think critically, but it means evidence-based research. It means evidence-based thinking. It means avoiding bias, avoiding data that pleases you as opposed to data that doesn't please you. And this applies not just in science, it applies in life, doesn't it? How much can I be objective about what I'm doing? This idea of mine, it's just not working. It's time to drop it. You know, you need to think critically. And the next thing on my list is the pursuit of truth. Science is the pursuit of truth. Applied science, less so perhaps than pure science, but it's narrowing the uncertainty. We will never know everything. We know that. We are very limited in our intelligence. That's obvious when you look at what's happening in the world today. And we're limited in our ability to work together. We are easily encouraged to oppose one another in groups that make us fear less. It's quite pitiful, the human mind in many ways. And the pursuit of truth is hard. It's something that can't be reached, but we can narrow the uncertainty. The sun will come up in the morning, says one person, says a scientist. The sun will almost certainly come up in the morning. There's always uncertainty, and we have to live with that and pursue the truth. I feel very strongly about breadth of knowledge, and I didn't get this as a student. I didn't get this as a 25 or even 35-year-old. It came with age. And unfortunately, it came a bit late in my case. And there are reasons for that. But I wish I had pursued breadth of knowledge earlier. I'll give you examples. I was very interested in math, even as a school kid, but I never read enough mathematics when I was younger. I wish I had. I wish I'd read more about what was going on in other fields. And we could elaborate on those other fields. But strive for breadth of knowledge. Changing the subject slightly, when you do that, it would be awfully useful if you have not just the need for champions, but among those champions, the need for mentors and heroes. I'll give you an example. I never met my first hero for 10 years after I first discovered him. I hope you've heard of him. His name is Alfred Fritz. He died a few years ago. You will never be the same again after you've read a paper by Alfred Fritz. He is incredible. He also was an incredible person. So he's a hero, even though I'd never met him for much of the time when I was so impressed. When I got to meet him, even more so. He's not a mentor, but he's a hero. He's someone who I would like to be compared with. It won't happen, but he's an amazing guy. And it's because of his ability to think through ideas and see patterns that the rest of us didn't see. An amazing hero. And mentors, I can count on one hand, just about, maybe 6 or 7 people, possibly, without whom I couldn't have done whatever it is that I've done. People who said to me, I was working in industry at the time, Len, have you got a moment? Can you come to the office? This is what we used to call our boss. And I thought, oh my God, I'm being fired. Why does he want to talk to me? A man from Holland named Arie van Roon, almost certainly not alive anymore. Len, are you happy in your job? And I said, yes. He said, but you're going to leave, aren't you? How would he know that? I couldn't see how he knew that I was going to leave. He's right. I was going to leave. I found a job for you in our research lab in Ottawa. There was nothing to be gained by Arie in picking me out of the group and helping me get a job in a research lab of the company. He didn't want me to leave the company, but he helped me. My PhD supervisor was the same. He didn't supervise me in research. In fact, he didn't really know what I was doing, but he cleared the way for me to get my PhD, leave the United Kingdom, and come to the Canadian group that I wanted to join. These people are so helpful. People who go out of their way to help you when they have nothing to gain from doing it themselves. And then you hope that you can do that for other people when you become into their position. So mentors and heroes is important, as is my next topic, standing on the shoulders of others. We don't always recognize that. My previously mentioned Alfred Fritz used to stand at the back. I'd stood with him on occasion in a conference presentation where he would see his work from 3 decades earlier being rediscovered and represented by people who had never read his papers, never read his work, and thought they were not standing on anyone else's shoulders. We all stand on the shoulders of others. And you can go back to Greek philosophy, you can go back to the research in Egypt on geometry. We all stand on the shoulders of others, and sometimes quite recent shoulders. And we need to recognize that our ideas percolate from the ideas of others. And it's very hard to have a truly, truly original idea. Don't kid yourself. It's tough. And it doesn't have to be original to everybody on the planet. As long as it's original to you and you can pursue that idea, you're okay. So standing on the shoulders of others is an important thing to recognize that you are doing. Related to that is what Fritz taught me was old wine in new bottles. What goes around comes around. It is amazing how many new ideas, whether it's quantum computing, artificial intelligence, whatever it might be, if you search far enough and wide enough, you will find that sometimes, I'll give you an example. I did a summer consultancy in 1968 at the Royal Radar Establishment in Malvern, England. And as the name implies, they were very active in World War II. I thought, well, I was hired to teach them about active filters. Well, what a joke that turned out to be. Ted Good, who you can still look up, Girling and Good articles in Wireless World, a genius who could quote Shakespeare verbatim, every single play, that was one of his many attributes, said to me, Mr. Bruton, because we didn't use first names in those days, have a look in that drawer. I look in the drawer, long story short, aged yellow documents of vacuum tube circuits. And when I translated those vacuum tube circuits to null-ors, you need to go and learn about null-ors perhaps, I realized that in 1943, 1944, Ted Good had discovered most of the latest RC active inductorless filters that we had rediscovered many decades later. Amazing, old wine in new bottles. The new bottle is the transistor. The old bottle was the vacuum tube, but the circuits were the same. I asked him, why didn't you publish this? Yeah, Wireless World's been asking me to publish it. I should get around to it. He was more interested in Shakespeare than telling the rest of us about the brilliant idea. And by the way, these documents had top secret classified written on them and have been declassified, and that was why I was allowed to read them. Old wine in new bottles. Search for the old wine. I want to make a comment about genuine collaborations. I get a bit disheartened about collaborations that are not genuine. That is, they're done to move up the metrics. You know, people who, when you say to them, I really enjoyed your paper in da-da-da-da article, and they say, well, what paper's that? And then you remind them of the paper, and they've forgotten that they were an author because they had nothing to do with actually publishing it. It's playing the game, and it's called the metrics game, and you increase the metrics by multiple authorships. It's understandable why people do that, because we can allow machines to decide how good we are. Computers that are algorithms that say what our merit increments as professors are going to be. Avoid it like the plague. Collaborate, but genuine collaboration is what is so important. So that's the list of arguments that I think relate to things that haven't changed very much over the last 60 years or so. Now, again, I've got my eye on the clock here, so we're 7:56. I've got a few other things to say. The PhD degree, some of you might be thinking of it, and or the master's degree. I did both, and I did them all part-time. I had full-time jobs while I did my master's degree and while I did my PhD. That's an incredible advantage if you've got the energy, because while you're doing quote unquote real jobs, you're finding out what the real problems are. And you can go back into your research mode and solve problems to which the answers are really important, as opposed to doing something that's just academically interesting. Now, why would you do a PhD versus a master's degree? In my view, we have too many people electing to do PhDs around the planet and not enough possibly doing master's degrees. There's nothing wrong with a good master's degree. In fact, there's a great deal to be said for it. You need to have a reason to do a PhD. It's arduous, it involves a lot of sacrifice, and it may or may not pay dividends. It's a risk. Be careful about doing a PhD. Make sure you want to do it. Curiosity and passion should drive you, not the job at the end, in my opinion. Now, what about selecting a research topic? This is a difficult one. Students coming out of an undergraduate program may be lucky, and they may have worked with people who got them interested in a particular research topic. And that's fine. That's what you hope for when you take an undergraduate student and do summer work together or whatever. But I'm particularly thinking for the PhD research topic. What would drive you? If you're not passionate about your research topic, drop it. Either do something else than a PhD or find another topic. You've got to get up in the morning and want to go for it. And if you don't feel that way, you shouldn't be doing it because it's depressing. You're doing it for the sake of getting those 3 letters after your name, and that is not a good idea. On the other hand, if you feel this is so exciting, I can't wait, getting the PhD itself becomes incidental. It's getting your ideas out there to the rest of the world that is the important thing, and the PhD comes along with it. The PhD is not the goal. It's the recognition of what you've been doing. The issues around a PhD vary with respect to discipline, in my opinion. There's the issue of relevance versus originality. You know, it's interesting to look at this because Hardy of Cambridge, a famous mathematician, number theorist, actually boasted, as some of you may know, that his work was completely useless, and he had great confidence that it would always remain useless. Brilliant mathematician. Him and Littlewood did fantastic work with Ramanujan from India on number theory. Well, he was wrong. It turned out in cybersecurity and other areas, RSA codes for encryption, his work has turned out to be actually very important. He might have been quite disappointed by that. So at one extreme, you have anticipated complete irrelevance, but you have originality. And we tend to say in engineering, that's not for us. But I wouldn't exclude it. I remember spending time with a student on what does a 3-dimensional Mandelbrot set look like? We had no particular application in mind. We were intrigued by the Mandelbrot set, as perhaps you are, but what is it the shadow of? It's in 2D. What is it the shadow of? And I remember the student I was working with coming in to see me and saying, Dr. Bruton, I'm so sorry. I found a book in the bookstore, Springer Verlag publication in pure mathematics. Someone's already got the answer. Does that mean we wasted our time? No, it doesn't. And I'll tell you why. Because of what we learned on the way. We learned about hypercomplex numbers, not just complex numbers. And that was useful in other areas. So doing original work that is not relevant is okay. But doing relevant research as applied scientists, which most of you will be, is really important. Now, if we're doing relevant work at the doctoral level, I used to say this to Chamira, and we used to smile about it. I used to say, you're looking for a topic, avoid second and third order effects as the main topic. And you know what we're talking about. We're talking about overflow, underflow, if it's digital filters, talking about thermal noise, if it's active filters, whatever. You don't really want to start a research career, and a PhD especially, on studying the second and third order effects of other ideas that already exist. The trend, as you know, light fields is a good example of that, where the basic ideas get established and well understood, and then armies of people come along afterwards writing PhDs on second and third order effects. Some of them are probably pretty good, but if you want to get to the top of your field and you want to really be in a leadership position in research, you're better to look for something that is a primary effect, a primary pattern, a primary idea, not a secondary or tertiary idea. Now, another important point in selecting a research topic, in my opinion, is looking for interdisciplinary connections and patterns. This is really important. It turns out that if you spend enough time looking at what mechanical engineers are doing, for example, civil engineers, applied mathematicians, physicists, astrophysicists, just read widely at what other people are doing. And when you do that, you get to my next topic. You're looking for patterns. I'll give you an example in my own career. When I was first studying RC active filters, I was at the University of Newcastle on Tyne as a lecturer and doing my PhD in the evenings and on the weekends. And every single person in a very large research group that I was not part of was studying synthesis of RC active filters using one amplifier. And I had convinced myself that that was not the way to go. It didn't fit the pattern of what had been achieved with passive filters. It's called the Keller equation. It has to do with passivity and the conservation of energy. All those single amplifier methods involved highly ill-conditioned polynomials. There was no way on God's earth that any of those methods was going to lead to realizations. You can say the emperor has no clothes, and that will make you very unpopular, or you keep your mouth shut and you work on what you have got as your idea, distinct from that. It's lonely. It's lonely. Sometimes it means not necessarily being the most welcome person on the planet, but you choose your own direction and you look for connections in other fields. In my case, and I can only talk to you from my own example here, the fields that I was connecting with, Sidney Darlington, Belovich, people who did their work in the 20s and 30s, how come they built filters with a certain specification, with components, inductors and capacitors that were 1% accurate? Whereas to do the same thing with a single amplifier filter, we needed an accuracy of 1 part in 10 to the 7th. You'll never get a capacitor that accurate. Why is that? You look for patterns, and those patterns were 20, 30-year-old wine in new bottles. So look for patterns that connect across the disciplines. And when you do that, learn the buzzwords in those disciplines. In my first job in Montreal, in Canada, at first I thought I was just going to sink because I didn't understand the words they were using. And I can remember people saying to me, how did you get through school without knowing what a dBm is, as opposed to a dB? Well, nobody taught me. This must be difficult. And many, many other things I could give you where the buzzwords, the lingo of the trade, made you think at first, I'll never understand this. But when you dig deeper, you find out that different disciplines use their own phrases for exactly the same phenomenon that you do understand. We've been doing work in astrophysics, in radio astronomy, algorithms for radio astronomy. When I first entered that field, I thought, there's no way I'm going to figure out what these people are doing. But after a while, you realized it's what you've already been doing. You just use different language. So don't be put off by buzzwords and don't let them scare you. I'm almost through my list of possible research topic considerations. Another one would be to consider societal need, local and global. That is important. if I look at what I was trying to do when I went to those research labs, what I was looking at was the societal need. Actually, Canadians are pretty modest about what we achieve. In civil engineering, we build roads through Rocky Mountains like you wouldn't believe and think nothing of it. And in telecommunications, when we first set up the first longest high quality analog television system, that was the societal need. Canadians wanted to talk to each other from coast to coast to coast. Unlike Sri Lanka, it's a very large country. We needed leading edge technology to do it. But when I looked at it, not only was it all analog because the word digital hadn't appeared then, we're talking the late 60s, but it was all rack after rack after rack of LC filters. They had one thing going for, or two things going for them, low tolerance values, but they were passive. So when you talk to people whose careers were tied up with these massive racks of filters, these systems were nothing but filters, they didn't want to talk about anything else. And when you've got this young buck Bruton coming along saying, well, you can build a 14th order bandpass filter from 104 to 108 kilohertz, kind of brick wall frequency response, and you only need 14 op amps. They look at you with glazed eyes. 14 op amps? You got to be kidding. They're not rude enough to say that, but that's what they're thinking. And I'm thinking, but in the end, op amps are going to be a fraction of the cost of a capacitor. Now, if you're working away in your academic office in a university, you're not going to be aware of that, or you're unlikely to be aware of it. When you're in industry, you ask for change and you say, can you give me the time to work on this and try to prove that with 14 op amps at 10 cents an op amp, not $10, which was the current price, we've got a winner here. And the answer is, no, we can't give you the time. We've got work to do. So you go and join a university, which is what I did. So what I'm saying is you should consider societal need. You come back realizing that there's a need for these filters, but possibly even the people using them don't see it. And then there's the local versus the global, and I'll get to the local now. I'm not obviously aware of the problems in Sri Lanka as well as you folks are, but when we talk about local versus global societal need, I would suggest that there's some pretty obvious ones in Sri Lanka that bright people like yourselves can address and probably are addressing. Energy would have to be number one. It's obvious that you and the rest of many other countries are susceptible to things you can't control, such as the price of energy. And we all know that the United States has determined that the amount of solar energy in a photograph of the United States, the number of photons falling on one pixel of that photograph is enough to power all the energy the United States needs. We've got plenty of energy coming our way. Solar would be a pretty obvious one. Transportation, another one. We've all adopted cars and the need for gas guzzling as a way of life. But maybe if you're in Sri Lanka, you start thinking about transportation systems in a different way. Agriculture and food production would have to be other areas that would be striking relevance to the heart of a Sri Lankan, I would suggest. And many of those are shared by Canadian local needs. I want to say something about selecting a supervisor or a supervisor selecting you. I actually mean this quite seriously. I say your supervisor should not supervise you. I hope Chamira finds that funny because I tried hard not to supervise him. That has a role, a word, I don't like it. A supervisor should listen. Supervisor should guide, critique, suggest, encourage, and perhaps most important of all, care. Care about the person. And it's hard to do because when you're supervising, there's a tremendous temptation to tell that person what to do. I think at the master's level, that's fine. You can do that. You can say, look, why don't you write a program that does this and gives this as the output, and then we'll compare it with what Mary or Joe down the road is doing, and supervise you pretty closely, but not at the doctoral level. At the doctoral level, it's your show, and the supervisor is a guider, an encourager, and a carer. Now, I'm going to go out on the limb for my final comments, and then I'm going to be quiet, and hopefully you folks might have some questions and things you'd like to discuss. If somebody was to put me on the spot today and say, well, what topics do you think would make good doctoral topics? As I said to Chamira before we came on air, so to speak, I'm not going to be specific about that question, but I anticipate it. So if I'm going to get the question, let's look at things that in this year might be important as they evolve, so that in 10 years' time, if you're going to do a PhD today, you'll be lucky to have an impact within a decade. So let's look at 10 years' time. What kinds of things might be important when we look back and say that that group that started doing its research in this area or that area, they were ahead of the game. They saw things that we didn't see. Now, the thing about research is you have to understand you're going to be wrong far more often than you're going to be right. If you can't handle failure, don't do it. Most of my ideas fell flat, and I'm okay with that. But you hope to have a few that didn't. So here's one of the things I've been thinking about. We all know about artificial intelligence, or we know of it. We know that we're building thinking machines that some people think can outthink the human brain and so on. But what we also know from social scientists, actually from zoologists of all folks, I don't know if you read Richard Dawkins, but he's a marvelous writer from Oxford. He coined the phrase meme and memetics as a subject, a unit of thought. A unit of thought would be something that I say that stays in your brain. It may be in a modified form, just like a gene mutates. And then it sits in your brain and dies there, or gets modified and mutated in a slight way, and then you repeat it to someone else, and it grows exponentially. That's what memes are. They're as trivial as a word that gets used over and over and again, phrase that gets used. Well, do we understand how the brain communicates memes, memetics, things that grow genetically, by analogy with the gene? So my phrase is mathematical memes between thinking machines. How do our artificial intelligence machines, they're supposed to be imitating the brain operates through memes. How do we arrange for our artificial intelligence machines to talk to each other? What are the criteria? What is the information that we should extract from this multi-layer, highly nonlinear neural network that's mimetic in character, that has the ability at low bandwidth, low transmission to connect from one machine to another, and the other machine takes off and weighs it internally and decides to go on and pass it to yet another machine. Dangerous business, you might say, but interesting. Another topic I would say is catastrophe theory. We live in a catastrophic world, and we're no good at predicting what's going to happen in a catastrophic world. A book I read by two German social scientists was called The Logic of Failure. We live in a complex adaptive system, and it fails again and again. And particularly our politicians, they really don't have a clue. They make changes and they don't understand what leads to the failures in our society. So catastrophes in math and in society is another area. Another obvious and specific one will be energy storage mechanisms. I was reading about gravity storage mechanisms. Photovoltaics and solar would be another. And finally, you can't ignore cybersecurity and the whole business of what I call the windshield effect in the internet, where media allows us to be anonymous and thereby get away literally with murder. So at that point, I'm going to stop talking, turn you back to Chamira, and the show is yours, and I'll do my best to try and help. Okay, Chamira?
Thank you very much, Professor Bruton, for your actually very nice and interesting presentation. Actually, I was also went back 10 years ago, but we we frequently had some discussions recently as well. And thank you very much for sharing your valuable thoughts. Actually, I hope that basically our young students as well as some of the young faculty would get the this information is very useful. And so now we could move into the question and answer session. So we are basically scheduled in under 3 categories. So the first we would go for the under the topic preparing for a career in research. So if you have any of the questions, it is your time to ask from Professor Bruton. Professor Broadness, so basically I have basically one question. So the one of the challenges in Sri Lanka would be actually as a university, and so we do not have a probably the best graduate program.
Sorry, you do not have what?
Yeah, so the best graduate program at the University of Morocco. So it's challenging to go on par with the top universities at the world. And also as a, for example, in the lecturer in Sri Lankan University and in the Canadian or top US or Australian or Europe University, what is your advice? So what is the best way we could move towards actually improve those graduate programs?
Yeah, that's a tough one, Chamira. I had the good fortune to visit Sri Lanka, and through that process, observe the incredible competence of your students. But that was fortunate for me. Most people, and I mean this in the nicest way, are not familiar with your university and not familiar with the quality of your undergraduate students. I took a look at, I'm talking about over a decade ago, the school system, the examination system, and how tough it is to get into your university. The quality of your undergraduate students, as I said earlier, is generally excellent, but I'm not sure the world knows that. So I guess my first piece of advice, if it's necessary, maybe it's not, but for me, when I talk to people in Canada about students from Sri Lanka, in particular Maratura, they don't know what I'm talking about. That's a great pity, because we have lots of students from India, from China, from all over the world. We have clusters of Sri Lankans because people like yourself, Thushara Gururatne, Arjuna Majinaki, there's a whole bunch of you. You pioneered, and out of that has grown small clusters of Sri Lankan students. Obviously, the developed world can afford to pay your salary, and does, and gets excellent return on its investment. But they can't do that if they don't know about you. So I think a little bit of breastfeeding is in order here. It's something for your administration to do, perhaps, but it's necessary. And people like myself, Panagathoklis, others who've had the privilege of supervising Sri Lankan graduate students can help you in that, and should help. You've got to get the word out, because you won't get a postgraduate program going unless there are more people like you who get their experience somewhere else and then bring it back home. You've got to start somewhere, and it's a long process, and it involves step one, letting people know what you're all about and how competent your students are. I don't know if that helps, but that's my thinking.
And also basically, so nowadays actually mostly so actually it's sometimes pressure on some of the young researchers in the world as well. So basically the research is measured through the H index and the like the impact factors and those kind of things. So the also, yeah, there is a topic, something like that, publish or perish. So actually, so in that, with this pressure, and also want to do some pioneering work, and so that will take long time, probably 1 to 2 years for one paper. So as young people, and so for young people, how do you actually advise in this in this dilemma, basically?
Yeah, well, you can hardly expect an answer which says, you know, you need to change the world. You can't do that. You can only operate through individuals who have a different idea of what the metric should be, right? And that means reaching out. I can give you, perhaps not quite so relevant, but the reason I got hired in Calgary, just to give you an example, out of the UK, was because one individual, Swami, who was a professor there and is now a professor at Concordia and still publishing like crazy, told the department head, go and talk to this guy Bruton while you're on vacation. I've just reviewed one of his papers. It's a really interesting idea. One paper, one. That wouldn't get you much of an H index, would it? But it came by somebody listening to of someone he respected, the opinion he respected. You need to work. There's no easy answer to this, because the easy thing to do is what's done right now. Let computers decide how good our research is. And that just doesn't work. You want to get the really good people at the front end of their careers. And what you need to do is to establish links to individuals, write personal letters to people. But in the case of Canada, University of Toronto would be a good starting place. University of Waterloo, UBC, there's lots of University of Alberta, I think Calgary also, very good universities. Try to establish personal relationships, because that's how it's going to happen. As you said, it almost takes playing the numbers game, to be honest, with this H and I citation indices. You know, when you're at my age, it's very tough, because most of our good work was done before we had these massive amounts of publications and citations and all the rest of it. So you have some very good work, not necessarily mine, obviously, but many people did good work early on that people have not heard of, just because the index doesn't pick them up as it should. So there's no easy answer to that, I don't believe, except work one-on-one with people who care and who realize the quality of the students that you would be sending, hopefully many to return.
Yeah, thank you very much. And now we will move into the second part of the questions and answers. So that is under the selecting a research topic and good practice. So any of in the audience, if you have any question, you could ask.
Yes, Professor Bruton, I'm Ranga Rodrigo.
Hi.
My question is, with the explosion of papers on the internet, archives, journals, conferences, and so on, how would you navigate through to find the right topic? So it seems that every single idea that we have has already been done by people.
I don't think that's true. I think the first part of what you said is right on. I mean, it's an explosion of knowledge. But I have to ask you a question in answering your question. Where have you been reading? Because what I find is when you take the courage to jump into another swimming pool than the one you've been swimming in, I'll pick some examples: astrophysics, seismology, biochemistry, whatever, and just read what's going on. But take with it, obviously, you have to, that explosion of knowledge that you're aware of in your own field. And that, I don't know, might relate to linear systems, nonlinear systems, the control systems, whatever is your bag of where you're reading of thinking every good idea has already been taken. That's not true, because there are other disciplines that don't know what they need until you talk to them. So I would start, I recognize Australia and New Zealand have this problem in spades. They can't afford to go to the many, many conferences that Canadians, for example, and Americans can go to on their own continent, short flight, 1 or 2 hours. But you have the internet now, like you said. So that overcomes the difficulty of traveling to conferences. But you can build relationships with people in other disciplines. And you will perhaps find, hopefully, that they are unaware of the progress that's being made in your discipline. And your discipline taken quite widely. You could wrap up everything from communications to quantum computing, a whole bunch of things. But you talk to people in other fields and you'll find perhaps that there's a thirst, even if they don't recognize it, for ideas from somewhere else. So look for patterns, look for cross-disciplinary solutions, and hope that you find something outside of your own field.
Thank you, Professor Bruton. Thank you.
Does that help?
It did help. Yes. It makes perfect sense. Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Professor Bruton, there is one question asked in the chat. So actually, this is from a student in the first year in the university. And so in the last 2 years, basically due to the COVID and also they had about 1 to 2 years time without any academic work. So the question is, during last 2 years without doing anything, and now I can't come back to the form during on my advanced level, that's a school level performance. I have lost my interest on understanding new concept. Is any ways to get it back? So basically due to the lack of academic work in the last 2 years, this student has lost interest on understanding new concepts. So he's asking whether your advice on to find interest again. Is it clear?
It's clear and it's very sad.
Yeah.
It's very sad. And I'm sure it's perfectly genuine.
Yes.
I've had students even quite recently, and I wonder how they survived. This is students who are already in university, paying tuition and getting almost nothing back in return, learning very little. It's very sad. And that's not what your student is wanting to hear from me. I would say that, again, it's been repetitive, but what was it I said in my list? Curiosity, determination, confidence, and personal sacrifices. They were some of the first things I mentioned. It's tough when you're 17 or 18. I would think that self-education might be a big part of where you're at right now. You perhaps need to read what is going on in the world that we live in, and take the best of the ideas that you can find out there to see if any of them excite you. I'm trying to mentor a young woman who was having, young girl, woman, 17. I don't know her, actually. It's only through Zoom that I'm trying to help her. And she was interested in astrophysics, basically, and I'm not an astrophysicist. And she was having trouble getting, because of COVID, getting advice on the telephone about how to get into first year. That doesn't get you even close to astrophysics. Now, we don't have the time to discuss this whole process, and I'm not wanting to claim that I helped her more than I actually did. But I would say that through people like myself, she's now in third year. She's doing astrophysics. She's spending the summer out at the Romney Observatory, and we might be able to get her into Penticton or even the Chile one. We don't know. But we're trying to help her because she's reached out through her grandfather, and then her grandfather happens to be a friend of mine. And we say, well, why don't you so-and-so? So-and-so, it's Thushara, who you know well, Thushara Gunaratne. And so a small group of people have been able to help. And I'm very hopeful that she's going to have a successful career. But it's because she reached out and talked to people like me who can help. And I would say to your student, whose name I don't know, talk to you for sure, talk to other professors in the department, get some names of other people to talk to. And I mean talk to, not email. Pick up the phone. We still have phones, I think, and actually talk to people. And you just might strike a chord that resonates with someone. This is what this young woman did. I've never, as I said, I've never met her, but I can see that there's something about her that was feeling thoroughly let down by the bureaucracy at the University of Calgary. I was ashamed that we didn't have people who could advise her. And now she's getting the right advice and she's on the right track. So my advice to your student is do more reaching out. You're reaching out by attending this webinar. Reach out to others, pick up the phone, give them a call, and try to find out what it is that you can be passionate about learning more about. It's a fascinating world, and my goodness, humans have got problems. And if you can make a small contribution as your legacy, you should do it. So pick yourself up by your own bootstraps and get going.
Thank you so much for the answer. And I think it's a very, very good advice for all the students. And yeah, conversation is very important, and reaching the correct person for the mentor and advice. So now we move into the last part of the question and answers, the open Q&A. So anyone of the audience have a question, you can directly ask or send in the chat so that I could ask. So I have one last question. Basically, so nowadays there are not the buzzwords, but mostly the world is, or the research world is mainly working on the deep learning, machine learning, IoT, and those kind of things. And probably we are working on the multidimensional signal processing. So not catching themes these days. So how do you basically advise on? So this would be similar for many others as well. So we have the determination, and we feel that we could contribute to this field. But within this world, all the people are talking about machine learning and all of these things. These buzzwords, how to go in a traditional field, or basically not so hot in the words. Could you briefly advise on this?
Somebody once said to me, you need to learn how to discuss what you do and what you're interested in terms that a lay person would understand in a social, not scientific setting. When somebody says to you, so what do you do for a living? And if you start talking about multidimensional signal processing or quantum computers or whatever, you're going to turn most people right off. Their eyes are going to glaze over. Learn to talk the language of the people who want to hear what you have to say, not your language, but their language. So it becomes important not to get research grants. I'm not talking about that. I'm trying to address your issue of relevance of research and working with others. Learn to tune your message to the listener. I had awful problems with this when I first started radio astronomy. We were just talking past each other because I was using my language, they were using theirs, and never the twain shall meet. You only learn through reading what other people are doing. And when you read what they're doing and you learn to interpret it, they will often come to you. This happened, again, it's a personal story, but Hewlett Packard, the then phenomenal instrumentation company, they haven't done so well since. I hope I had nothing to do with that. And that they had a problem that they didn't know they had. And I was at an industrial, academic seminar for industrial people in Palo Alto in California. And I was young and I went because I had the energy and the interest. And I had no idea that anybody from Hewlett Packard was in the audience. But I think I did it right because I described the spectrum analyzers were of interest. They were the world leaders, along with Rode and Schwarz in Germany, on the world's construction of spectrum analyzers instruments. And we're talking audio and a little bit above in frequency. It wasn't very high frequency in those days, but the need for very sharp filters. They didn't know what their problem was. That was the difficulty. And by giving a presentation that hardly had an equation in it, I'm sure there was a few, but and it wasn't dumbed down. It was just interpreted in ways that they understood. And the next thing that happened was a fellow who was Associate Dean of Medicine gave me a call and he said, I've just come back from Palo Alto in California. And this guy heard you give a presentation, but he didn't get your name. Can you give him a call? And I gave him a call. And out of that connection came a completely new design for a generalized impedance converter based, high order active filter, low noise amplifiers that only Hewlett-Packard could get their hands on, and that went into their latest spectrum analyzer. So that came about through going to a seminar and interpreting things in language that they will understand because of its language that they use in their field. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, yes, that's fair sense. So is there any other questions from the audience?
Yes, Professor Bruton, I have one question, and that is more regarding the standardized tests we have, because I feel like more of our tests are based on memorization alone. And my problem with that is, so when it's more about memorization, I tend to forget it completely after the test. And therefore, I lack the ability to apply the knowledge I gained. So, so in terms of research, I feel like this affects it because we are only focused on memorizing, but not really researching. So what are your thoughts in mitigating this impact?
I think it's a good question if I understood it. Can I ask you, are you in a graduate program at the moment?
Yes, I'm currently at in my second semester.
And what degree are you studying for?
Electronics and telecommunication.
A BSc or master's or PhD?
BSc.
BSc. I'll tell you something about my own experience that might make you feel better. When I was doing my BSc, I didn't even know whether I really wanted to go through with it. Really. There was so much memorization, and this is the old British system as it was in the 60s. It's probably changed now, hopefully. But I was really lost as an undergraduate student. My major was I will never work in a university, and two, I will never go near a computer, because both of those things depressed the heck out of me. Computer programs, the computer was remote. It was in Manchester. I was in London. Didn't work most of the time. And it was a very depressing experience. I graduated, got a job in the quote unquote real world, and then started to yearn for the knowledge that I should have acquired when I was at university. A little bit late, you might say. And I went into bookstores and I got books on control theory and operational mathematics, Laplace, Heaviside, blah, blah, blah. And suddenly realized there was good stuff that I was being taught, but I wasn't mature enough or broad enough to understand the relevance of what I was being taught. So one thing I would urge is patience, that if you are genuinely curious, prepared to be disappointed at the bachelor's level. You know, we're trying to graduate professional engineers. We're trying to produce generalists at the baccalaureate level. And it can be pretty frustrating if you're thinking of doing research because you never get time to do it. I had one professor, well, actually two of them working together, who recognized my curiosity and gave me a project in an anechoic chamber. I was really lucky. It was in my final year. And I was able to literally take two loudspeakers made by Goodman's and slice one of them apart with a razor blade and analyze it as a lumped, an acoustical analogy or analog to a lumped circuit, and thereby predict the behavior of that loudspeaker at different frequencies, phase and magnitude. That was the only project at the undergraduate level that really turned me on, but it was enough. And the other one was a professor named Alistair MacFarlane. I'm not saying the other professors weren't good professors. They were, but it was memorized. Just what you said. Learn this, learn that, and regurgitate it at the exam. We'll get a whole bunch of graduate students to mark it, and there you are, we'll tell you what you're worth. That's just the way it is. But there's more to the world than that. Look for the diamonds in the rough. Look for the Alistair MacFarlanes. And by the way, that professor went on to become Chancellor of the University of Oxford. He was a young man at the time. He was late 20s, but he excited me beyond belief. So don't get discouraged, but be patient and continue to be curious and read and talk to the people that excite you intellectually. That's the only answer I can give right now.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, I mean, thanks for sharing anecdotes like that. Yeah, it really meant a lot.
It's okay.
So, Bruton, there is one question also from a first-year student. As a first-year student, many of the topics that is talked about in research seems complex.
Oh, yeah.
Can you?
It's breaking up. I'm not.
Write you. We cannot.
Is it clear now?
Yes, for me.
Okay, right. Yeah. As a first-year student, many of the topics that is talked about in research seems complex. Can you suggest the first steps to get to know more about research and gradually go deep into it? So this is from a first-year student, BSc. So he or she wanted to basically get the first steps to get to know about the research and gradually go deep into it. Yeah.
Yeah, I got two suggestions. Some of them repetitive, I must say, with what I've said earlier. Number one, get to know your professors. You know, go into their offices and chat with them. Tell them what you know. When you're a professor and you have dozens, if not hundreds of students, it's really impossible to get to know them as people if they don't take the initiative to get to know you. You know, I'm sure I've missed many, many good students by just not having. And the other thing as a professor, you don't want to show undue preference for particular students. You might suspect that a student has got something to give, but you must try to treat everybody the same. So until they reveal that they're not the same, that they have questions. I remember one student I had, he dressed differently than everybody else. He always sat in the back corner and he looked bored to tears with my lecture. And I learned from other profs, they felt the same way. He was close to 100% on all the exams, 97, 98%, hit the aces every time, obviously following everything. But sat there like this, had long hair, which was unusual in those days. It was a sign of antisocial behavior. And really, it troubled me greatly that he could be so bright and yet so apparently disinterested. And he finally plucked up the courage from his point of view, because he clearly was unhappy. It was in the body language. And he came to see me. And he asked me what I did for research. And we sat down and we chatted. And I couldn't believe what that young man, I'll tell you his name, I don't know where he's gone. He doesn't publish much, but he's one of the brightest students I've ever met. And I'm so glad I had the opportunity to learn from him. In those days, it was all about Fortran, of course. And we were writing synthesis programs based on Darlington's insertion loss theory, but applied to digital filters. And the only way I used to say it to other profs is that guy can make these things dance. He not only understood the computations, but he understood the theory, the underlying theory. He was an amazing student. So he reached out. That's the point. If he hadn't reached out to me or to one of the other professors, he would have just gone through the program, probably pretty bored, because I'm sure my lectures bored him. You know, my lectures weren't aimed at him. They were aimed at the class. And he was operating way above the level of the class. And I knew it because he was acing all the exams. But he needed to come and see me. And he did. And that's happened with more than one student. I just think of that particular student. So my advice to the person writing that to you, number one, be patient. You have to be patient. You're a first-year student. It's not going to happen overnight. Secondly, let others know. The young lady I was talking to you about earlier, who's the grandchild of my friend and who's now going out to the observatory for the summer, that's exactly what she did. She went to see the profs in the department of it's called physics and radio astronomy. And those profs got to know her and could see that she had potential. Don't be shy. Step forward. Say hi to the profs so they get to know you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Bruton, for your interesting ideas. And actually, this was really helpful. And actually, as a recorded session, I would share first with you and also with the others as well. I would like to thank you again. Actually, personally, I was mentored by you, and I am here because of your advices. Actually, I really thank for that as well. With Professor Van Agathoklix, and I am really happy that your ideas were so helpful, and also for the this talk, I think would be really important for our young kids as well. Thank you so much.
Dr. Chamira, the deep respect that you have for Professor Bruton is well founded. I saw that within the first 5 minutes, Professor Bruton spoke. I'm very fortunate that I decided to attend this talk. I learned a lot. I kept on writing down every single sentence Professor Bruton uttered. Every single sentence had a meaning, a generalized meaning, applicable, transcends through the country boundaries, continent boundaries, and time. I think so valuable. I think we must get the transcript of this speech and make it available to all our staff, faculty, and the students so that we can benefit from these great ideas that transcends time. Thank you, Professor Bruton. I'm so fortunate that I listened to you. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for training Dr. Chamira, Professor Madanayak, who's my batchmate, and Tushara Gunaratna and all. Thank you for those valuable ideas. Thank you. Have a pleasant afternoon, Professor Bruton.
Thank you. Nice meeting you.
Thank you, Professor Bruton, again. And so we will conclude the session and convey my regards to Avis and your children and grandchildren as well.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you. Okay, bye.